During last episode, we discussed the macro issues related to your book. Can we go into the specifics? So you mentioned what happened with the trial and the guy getting off. Um, how do you help spouses, partners, and family of survivors be able to process and support their experience?
Oh, okay. That's a broad question. I think that if we're looking at how to support uh, um, survivors, first off, from these three kind of key components that I find have been really helpful. And before we kind of get into that, it's really understanding what are we planning for as partners, because there's a lot of abstract things that we can talk about, but to kind of bring it real world, down into the micro of difficulty of what it is to be a partner, is looking at the worst case scenario, which is you're in the middle of a sexual experience with somebody who has a trauma history around sexual violence, and they have a PTSD reaction or a negative emotional experience trigger. And that can be anything: sight, sound, smell, a body memory, a flashback, something that happens that kind of sends them into a negative emotional space. And the big question is for partners of survivors is, how do we handle and manage our own emotions in that moment, as well as how do we show up and help the survivor as they are having this kind of negative experience. And if we look at that experience kind of as a concept, we could say that that's like high stakes exposure therapy. Because in every other case, a therapist who approaches exposure therapy, we would say, needs years and years of training to be a therapist, probably has a license that's being governed and regulated by some sort of state regulating body, in order to be able to provide this type of exposure therapy, if we're looking at pretty much every other trauma. But for this trauma, there is no other therapist that's going to be walking into this experience. It's going to be the partner. They're the only person on the planet that's going to be with the survivor as they bring intimacy and sexuality back into their life. So how do we plan for this? Have really kind of jumped out as the most beneficial and valuable things that I was able to kind of incorporate in my relationship with my wife when these moments would happen. And they sound easy on the surface, but they're really challenging when you're trying to execute them in the moment of heightened emotions. And I think it's valuable to think about, as a partner, what emotions are actually taking place, right? So if you're engaged in sexual activity, you have heightened arousal, you have all of this expectation, you're kind of marching towards this kind of plateau of orgasmic bliss, and in the flash of a second you are in a completely different situation emotionally, and it's really negative. There can be tears involved, there can be panic and fear, guilt and shame. There's a lot. And as a partner, how do we process our own feelings and then move forward to help the survivor process theirs as well? And what I have found is this first component of just being there. And what that means is, in practice, it means not having to create solutions. It means active listening. It means really just reacting and responding, and having a plan of really just being present in that moment. One of the things that has come up for me a lot in those moments is this feeling like I need to say something, because oftentimes, in this human experience, when we see somebody that we care about, or even, a stranger going through something, some kind of struggle, they've confided in us in some way, we feel the need to potentially offer solutions, say something, fill the awkward silence in the void. And, from my experience, the awkwardness of having a sexual experience, turn around and go 180 degrees into a very dark emotional place is really uncomfortable. And the silences there can be really uncomfortable. But what I've found best to keep my partner on a path of healing versus kind of, going down this other path and maybe further ingraining the trauma, maybe furthering the guilt and shame spirals by trying to say something and making it really uncomfortable and awkward, is just allow them time to process and take my own time to process. So just being there also means to self-regulate, pull yourself out of the frustration and the disappointment that the sexual situation didn't go the way you thought it was going to go. Being able to self-regulate your own emotions so that you can be present, so that when they start to share information with you about how they feel, what the emotional triggers were, anything of that nature, you can just say thank you often in these really uncomfortable situations. And I think it helps us to remember that we're really just trying to help in this moment. Nothing can really make it better. And so we just need to navigate this particular emotion, not cause any more harm, and help them process and get out of that really heightened state. And so just being there, saying thank you for sharing, is one way of doing that I have found that's been really beneficial. The next thing is making space. So if there was like a number two, it's making space, and this means emotional and physical space. And this is really challenging because there's no definitive answer to what this is going to be for the individual, the survivor, what they're going to need. This is going to have to either be talked about beforehand in case of like a preparation, like if this is going to happen or if it has happened before. We need to understand what type of physical space and emotional space might they need, because what we don't want to do is in that moment smother them with a lot of, trying to be all up in their space. They may need some space to kind of chill and process. They may be in a fetal position in tears, trying to process and reflect on, trying to get themselves out of that. And so we don't need to give them too little space, but at the same time, we don't need to just like automatically get up and leave the room and leave them kind of spiraling on their own. So there's kind of this Goldilocks period, which is kind of why it's challenging. It sounds easy. Making space just sounds easy. Like, okay, give somebody some space, but it's about finding the appropriate amount of space to let them know that we're there, that we care, that they're not going through this alone, that the exposure therapy that we walked into them with, because that's why the role and responsibility I talk about in the book is being so important, is because if we choose to engage in sexual activity with somebody who has a trauma history and they end up having a negative emotional reaction, well, we do now have a responsibility as somebody walking with this person through exposure therapy. If it goes in a negative space, we do have a responsibility then to help them navigate that space as much as possible. Making space is really challenging emotionally because we're in the midst of our own emotional experience. Like I said before, we're still pulling ourselves out of arousal, we're pulling ourselves out of disappointment and frustration. We still have, maybe a feeling of guilt or shame or shock or overwhelm at the amount of emotional swing that just happened. We could feel angry and rage at the fact that whoever harmed our loved one has, created this moment of incredible discomfort in our lives. And so all of these things, it's all flooding all at once. And, it's an incredibly complex cluster. And so making the emotional space can be very challenging, but it's something that I think if we are proactive about and have a plan for, then it becomes easier over time. You get familiar with the feelings, you get familiar with the process of self-regulating. I use a box breathing method that has really, really helped because it gives me something to focus on immediately. I don't have to focus on saying something. I don't have to focus on, what, the experience that they're going through. I'm focused on my own experience. I start breathing, with my wife, we actually set up a protocol that's like, if an emotional trigger happens, let's both start just this box breathing to help regulate our emotional state. And it really does, it really does help. It helps us make the emotional space that's necessary to, is the need for partners to help process emotions, their own emotions, outside of the relationship. So we're not reflecting a lot of the discomfort and pain that we're experiencing through their recovery process. We're not reflecting that back in. So all the uncomfort and the discomfort that we feel, we don't want to just reflect that back in the relationship. So we have to find kind of positive and healthy ways to do that outside of the relationship. Well, what relates to that is being able to find moments in your relationship that you can work on your relationship and talk about what happens and set up these times for strategic interventions, the box breathing, if that's something you want to implement. We need to be able to have those conversations outside of the heightened emotional times of kind of conflict and emotional disturbances. And so what my wife and I did was set up times that we call check-ins, and it was intentional time that we would sit down and open up conversations that sometimes get very challenging, but it allows us the opportunity. It kind of creates an emotional space that we can really talk about the challenging things at a micro level. So really finding out what the triggers are, really finding out what helps her that I do, and also what may have happened last time that didn't help, so that we can kind of adjust and move forward accordingly through the recovery process. And so it's really, really beneficial in my relationship, in my experience, to set up time that you are really intentional with, that will help you identify ways of moving forward that works for each individual's experience of recovery, and then just tweak and monitor it as you move forward. And having that kind of set time to check in was really, really helpful for us.
Shaun, I know you've done a lot of research and you have looked for ways to incorporate these techniques in your relationship. Has your approach for your self-discovery and the ways to assist your loved one come from your own therapy and couples therapy, or has it all been organic through your research?
Oh, yeah, I think it's a combination. I think that all life experience kind of plays into, how I learned and tried to move forward. I think a lot of unfortunately, a lot of what I learned was through, fortunately, to survivors. And the first time I was 15 years old, and that created a lot of challenge just based on ignorance and a lack of understanding around this issue. It was the first time I'd ever really faced it. Before that, it was more so like kind of a fictional idea that I saw sometimes in media, on TV or movies or something. And it was never something that I really faced, the reality of. And the first time that I faced the reality, it was very challenging. And I think every time I've faced that reality, it's been really challenging. But, with experience, you just gain insights, you gain wisdom, you gain ways of doing better. With my wife, it was so much more present, because when she was assaulted, we were in a relationship. And so there wasn't a lot of time for us to not be dealing with it. It was kind of present from the first 2 weeks that we started dating. And so it was just influenced a lot of how I showed up. And I think continues to, really. The research and the learning, the reading, all the books and documentaries and scientific papers that I've read and continue to read and really try and continue to educate myself, just furthers my understanding, my emotional intelligence, my communication skills. And it's not like we reach a day in which communication breakdowns don't ever happen, and that there aren't challenging times in relationships. outside of the recovery trauma. Maybe it isn't even about uh, the recovery from trauma, but it's still challenging in terms of kind of getting a lot of that is influenced by life experience and research.
Have you come across the idea of, you mentioned being dysregulated? There's this new stuff that's coming out about rewiring your brain, and that when your body is on the alert mode and having these, uh, it's not only emotional, but it's almost like your whole body shuts down or becomes hyper focused on the trauma response, that it takes a while for you to calm down. You mentioned intercourse, and we've all experienced where if you get into a heightened place, it's hard to come down from it, and it causes a lot of, you mentioned anger, frustration, and things like that. But this idea of taking time for someone to calm down and to get to a better place, it's a practice. Like you mentioned, the breathing and stuff like that. It's something that you have to work on, and that a lot of times most people don't have access to, because they don't come from or have been trained or raised in this idea that your mind, its spirit and body have to be in a homeostasis for you to be able to uh, make better decisions and think clearly and emotional and have that emotional intelligence. Um, what is the thing that you have seen in your research that uh, discusses that? Because nowadays people talk about stuff being imprinted in your DNA. They talk about um, your brain changing, um, like its form, or like being almost like rewired the moment you have trauma, that your brain
Mm.
changes. And a lot of these things, they're not fully flushed out. So people throw them out like at a TED talk or something. Is like uh, someone doesn't develop until they're 27 or something like that. And for most of us who have grown in like a traditional background, it sounds like psycho mumbo jumbo, psycho babble, because they don't explain it in a way that it makes sense. They just throw it out, and then they always have like an
Mm.
agenda or a point that they want to push related to that. So, how would you communicate these ideas to uh, just regular audience, people who are not familiar with them, so then they can like, oh, that's why my mom used to react like this. Oh,
Mm.
this is why a childhood friend was scared to be touched. And then it starts making more sense, and then you realize that there's multiple people in your life who have experienced this type of trauma, and we weren't aware, and we assumed that they were overreacting or um, freaking out for no reason. But this is like a very intimate pain and suffering that people go through, and unless you're aware and sensitive to that, you, even if you are, you might not be able to handle it or help them process it. So this knowledge and this understanding, making it part of yourself, is very important. But again, like we talked last time, the politics of it, the dismissive attitude of some cultures, this idea that everybody just need to walk off their own uh, experiences or things that bring them down. So this self-reliance culture that we live in gets in the way of the healing that has to happen.
Yeah, I think that last point you made, that political ideology and this kind of over hyper individualism can get in the way of healing is absolutely true. We as human beings are very tribal by nature. We're very community oriented, and we gain a lot of value to our lives on so many levels, not only emotionally, but mentally and spiritually, and of course, physically, by being a part of communities. And I think that what I would suggest is, if you're struggling understanding the ideas around how trauma affects kind of the neurochemistry. And again, I am nowhere near a, kind of neurochemical expert in terms of trauma and how it, uh, you know, reprograms our mind. But the way they experience it is that the that thoughts that wire, that fire together, wire together. Meaning that if your mind is kind of built through repetition in terms of if you sit and you think about something, if you want to learn information, right? Then what we can do is we can make flashcards and we can look at those flashcards, we can say it, we can write it over and over. And all of a sudden, those thoughts that we wanted to learn are going to wire together because we have continued to fire those thoughts over and over and over. And we are starting to form those new kind of neural networks that create those, thoughts and memories and all of the knowledge. But in the case of trauma, we already understand sometimes that there's this flashbulb memory, right? Where something big, monumental happens. And all of a sudden, it's like way more information is kind of taken in, right? It's kind of like, how can we talk about it in a way that people might relate to a little bit more? Today's day and age, most people have smartphones. Not everybody, but a lot of people, I think, that are going to be watching this have some sort of technology. And if we think about our camera and how it kind of takes in information and then processes that, the aperture is basically like this little device on your camera that either opens or shuts down in order to take in or kind of restrict the amount of light information that's coming into the camera. And if that aperture is like wide open, then it's taking in an incredible amount of information, and you can run the risk of what's called overexposing your image, which is basically information that it's trying to take in and it's just overwhelmed. Well, we can see the damage immediately that it's doing to this photograph, to this image that we want to take. We can see the kind of overstimulation that's kind of happened there. Well, if we just use that as a metaphor, right, just a visual metaphor to kind of understand trauma, where when trauma happens, it's like heightening all of our senses, right? Like all five of our senses, even the more like proprioception and other kinds of senses that may be present, all of that starts to just take in a whole lot of information. So it's kind of like they're all just open for input. And at the time, it's just flooding in all this information, and it's being stored in this, kind of flashbulb memory that we like to call it. And to me, that experience is really representative of just the energy present in experience. Like there's just this incredible amount of just we're not even conscious. Well, in the book, The Body Keeps Score, one of the kind of defining aspects of, just even in the title is that the body and the mind like store all of this information in different ways, and it can come out at different times. And one way to kind of explain this is kind of in my a past job, I was a massage therapist, a licensed massage therapist in Washington State. And one of the things that I found fascinating about that type of body work was how trauma is stored in the muscle tissue, like physical trauma. So a repeated use injury, right? One is that women carry purses. They usually carry it over their shoulder. They usually carry everything but the kitchen sink inside their purse. It's super heavy. So like one side's always kind of pulling down. Well, that repeated use over time, that kind of trauma that's on the muscles and the body is actually storing energy inside the muscle.
You were sharing that the trauma stays in your muscles in your body.
Yeah. So as a massage therapist, one of the things that I noticed, and this is across the board, a lot of massage therapists experience this as well, is when you go and you get certain muscle groups worked on, you can obviously let out that tension, right? People say, I hold tension, I hold stress in my body, right? And so we feel it accumulate throughout our daily lives, right? Most people carry tension and stress right up here in their neck and shoulders. And most people identify with the idea that they carry tension and stress in their muscles. And oftentimes when you go in and get a massage, and maybe you've experienced this, when you go in and you get certain areas worked on, uh, it can bring up feelings. And oftentimes it can feel really good to get that tension out of there and released. And there's other muscle groups that are notorious for causing different types of emotional reactions. And there is a muscle group called the psoas, which is it's a muscle that kind of tightly adheres to the spine, and it's so deep that you can't actually touch it. You can only influence it by going through your kind of abdominal wall, and you can kind of influence it and kind of work out and touch it in that way. And it is a muscle that is notorious for creating emotional releases in a lot of people, and the thoughts and feelings that come up are varied to the individual. And what it does is, this is just another metaphor, another example of how our body holds on to emotions, that holds on to trauma. And when we just kind of assimilate all of this knowledge and we recognize that the things we go through in life, they leave an impact. And the more traumatic things that we go through in life, they can leave a bigger impact. It's just a way of really understanding the experiences of others. And if we can relate it to things that we've been through, and that's why I just use this example of our muscles holding in tension and stress, is because if somebody has experienced trauma, like in the realm of sexual trauma, then their body is keeping score of that, just in the same way that, if you had a fight with your coworker at work or your boss, and you come home and your muscles are all tight and tense, and you're just feeling really stressed out. It's kind of the same concept in terms of like how I would relate that to somebody that was having trouble really accessing some sort of information, maybe through they're thinking about it through some sort of political ideology or framework. It's more so just looking at it from a body's perspective. Is our muscles hold energy? They just do. And we're tight, we're sore. It can be physical trauma, it can be mental and emotional stress that makes us all tight. And so, yeah, I think that's just a way that I would use to kind of get through to people that may be a little hesitant to understand how trauma might affect somebody.
So two things. In your research, did you find anything about advocacy? I know some people who are supporting certain causes, they get very concerned about new laws or limited funding or things like that that is available for people who have experienced this. And then how are you getting your book out and your message out? Is it only through podcasts and radio shows, or you're also doing a book tour? How are you disseminating this information? Because what I feel now is that we're oversaturated with programs and YouTube channels and things like that. So it's really hard to get good information out. And there's so much junk, and there's so much stuff out there that permeates our culture. So what are the steps to take to educate people and to get them to consider this very important step?
Yeah, let me address that first part. And I think it was around if I heard you correctly, it was about the laws that may be passed, and something around that aspect. And I want to say that there are some troubling laws that have been passed that I think really set the realm of sexual violence prevention back a ways, which is the opposition to a national standard for sex education, through a national program for K through 12 kind of a standard sex education program, and there's a lot of evidence that suggests that these types of programs help prevent all sorts of things, not only STDs and unwanted kind of teen pregnancies, but also help with gender violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence. And there's a lot of studies that show that these types of programs to help educate around the emotional context of relationships and the different kinds of consent, and just having these experiences of being able to be exposed to this information really helps long term, large scope prevent these types of environments from existing in which these types of abuse takes place. And so it is troubling that there's a lot of pushback in terms of trying to prevent some sort of nationalized standard for education. That gets into a whole realm of things, but I do believe wholeheartedly that we need a national standard for sex education. And, the younger that we can start educating kids around these issues, not necessarily like, I think the fear that gets talked about a lot is that we're going to educate kindergarten through third grade on pornography. And if we actually look at the bills that are going to get passed, like in Washington State, I actually in the book kind of quote the Washington State legislation in terms of the bill that was presented. And there's really no pornography or sex really at all. It's more so about educating the soft skills of emotional intelligence and understanding, what healthy relationships are, just even in friendship level and parental level, and interpersonal relationship dynamics and that kind of a thing. And all the language is about that. There's really no language about showing kids pornography, which is one of the things that is just a myth. But I want to ask if that answers the question that you had.
Yeah, and there was a big push of human trafficking awareness and support during the Bush administration, and then now with some of the extreme religious folks, they've made it all about human trafficking, and almost with the paranoia about the almost like the return of the demonic child abuse stuff from the 90s, and now trying to push that on some political parties and some individuals. They're all
yeah, and I
worried.
think that's a big distraction, unfortunately, because I have seen that as well. I've seen the big push for this whole concept of being like, there's all these, anytime you hear pedophilia in the media, more often than not, it comes with this slant of satanic ritual. And so they've paired this idea that that pedophiles are satanic, or organizations that seek kids are satanic. And I would push back on that, just in the sense that the Catholic Church is pretty. They bring in some pretty high numbers of child abuse, and it would be difficult to argue Satanism in that church. I think as well as the Mormons. The Southern Baptist Convention just had this massive scandal about the cover-up of child abuse going on in their organization. I think that there is a lot, when you read the FBI's kind of papers on child abuse statistics in America, a lot of it is just coming from individual homes. And so it's really challenging to see the conversation just always gets steered in the media, because our media does a very poor job of maintaining the integrity of stories, because they have a conflict of interest of like drawing attention to whatever their stories are. And it's a very kind of what's the word, like a fantastic story, like it's just this big thing that child pedophiles are satanic, and it just creates this like lore and this buzz that they just seem to push more and more. And yet, if you really look at the data, if you look at the stats, if you look at all of the stories from around the world, there are much larger organizations that are doing a lot of child abuse. I'm not saying that couldn't be present, because absolutely, I'm sure it has and is still. But the overwhelming amount that is actually present in these, quote, I mean, non-satanic religions, Christianity, alike all over the world, and all the different denominations of Christianity, they have a pretty large pedophile problem too. And I feel like there's just this distraction that happens from, the ultra religious people, is like they don't actually want to talk about the problems that are within their own denominations. They want to put it out there as if like this child pedophile thing is just the work of the devil. And I go, well, no, it's the work of pedophiles. It's not, it's not the work of some sort of supernatural spirits. It's based more in biology of, sexual needs, and like how they're trying to meet those sexual needs. And any place that, we grant adults access to children, just based on the sheer volume of pedophiles that exist in this world, there's any organization that grants adults access to kids is going to have a pedophile problem. It's just the nature of how that works. Is like, if you have 200 million pedophiles on the planet, just talking about men, that's quite a large number of people who are going to be seeking out how to meet their needs sexually. And when they have a predilection for young age kids, they're going to seek out the organizations that give them power, influence, and access to children. And predominantly in how our societies are organized, typically comes from, organizations like churches and the Boy Scouts and schools and sports teams, anywhere where we congregate a lot of kids and give adults access, there's going to be an issue and a problem. And so, yeah, I would push back on that idea of, just talking about it in the light of, satanic pedophilia, because I think that just distracts from the actual problem and the like real big issue. I know that, QAnon came out with that thing that was like George Soros and Hillary Clinton were running this giant pedophile ring, and, they get all this buzz around Jeffrey Epstein. And I go, okay, all of it's bad. Don't get me wrong. Democrats running a sex ring, Republicans running a sex ring. In my, understanding of it, I don't look at Democrats and Republicans as different. I look at them as the same, part of the whole of the political establishment. They all go to the same parties. They all go to the, they like for as long as we can remember, Democrats and Republicans were, they might fight in front of the cameras, but even Jesse Ventura, who got into the political establishment, who was a part of the WWE, who was a Navy SEAL, he talked about the inner workings of the American political system very, very bluntly, in terms of how in front of the cameras, they all act like WWE, like they're all these enemies, but then behind the scenes, they're all going to the same dinners. They're being funded by Goldman Sachs, and they're getting the same lobbyists and all of the same money that's coming at them. And so, like, I just struggle with that idea of being, that, oh, it's somehow George Soros and Hillary Clinton running this pedophile ring. Because yes, if that's true, which I don't actually see any data to support that. I think Jeffrey Epstein was his own thing. He's got friends on both sides of the aisle that flew to his island and all over the world. I mean, we saw world leaders like Prince Andrew and all of that get tied up into that thing. But the problem that I have with that is that even if we were to kind of microscope down into that problem, that's not actually even a tiny little, kind of aspect of the giant global problem that is pedophilia. I mean, that group of people, even they're powerful. It makes for great stories. It makes for the, rich versus poor. There's a whole lot of dynamics of, us versus them, and that makes a story compelling. But the real raw data doesn't suggest that is the only, nor even what we should be focusing on in terms of the giant pedophile problem. And because that conversation gets really uncomfortable pretty quickly in terms of just general society.
Shaun, have you come across this one wild situation? There was a professor, and I followed the story because it was just like a blurb, and it said, professor gets fired or suspended because he was promoting pedophilia as like a thing. Like, he was saying that in some cultures or morality based, there's really no case against it or something like that. So I actually followed the guy and found him on a podcast, and it was a philosophy podcast. And this guy was like off his rocker. Like he was saying that based on what happens in some cultures and the way that people develop and all these things, he was trying to like almost like water it down so much that it wouldn't be an issue anymore. And it was part of this idea that um, morality cannot be imposed on people, and it cannot be, and that's, it's not an innate thing. It was like a cultural thing. So him and this other guy went back and forth, and it was all like almost like counter Christian and counter like traditional understanding of virtue and stuff like that. And they went on and on and on and on. So not to focus on that guy and that kind of out there perspective, but this idea that as humans and maybe as Americans, there's a moral decline, and that people have become very relativistic about issues. So we talked last time that judges side usually with the perpetrators for whatever crazy reason, but you also have this idea that people have become very moralistically. It's not even syncretistic. It's more like it's almost like laissez-faire, or like if it's not my pig, it's not my farm kind of thing. Not my pig.
Yeah, I think we're hyper individualistic in that space. I think that I think part of that, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but I think that one thing that I feel just in my own experience of that kind of I would say apathy is when we look at a system, right? And we can't look at it and say it's like one particular thing. It's not in a vacuum. We have to kind of look at the big picture and realize that we exist in a system of authority that none of us feel like actually represents us, right? Like the right doesn't feel like the government represents them, and they fight tooth and nail. And the left doesn't feel like the establishment and authority represents them, and they fight tooth and nail. And we get pitted against each other, and we have so many issues. We have access to information that is unfathomable in human history, so we're connected so deeply to pain. We're a very sympathetic and compassionate species. We have the ability to empathize with others, and also we're a pattern recognizing, like our brains are just pattern recognizing machines. It's built into our very DNA for survival in order to be able to spot patterns and threats to our existence. And that gets hyper active when we're sitting in front of these devices that just pump in stories that we believe to be true. And that doesn't mean that they have to be true, but because our minds have a trouble distinguishing in the moment when you're just pouring over headlines from news organizations, like we said earlier, that don't really maintain the integrity of the actual story. They just use that, kind of hyperbole to get you to click on something. So they make something incredibly dramatic. Well, that has an impact over time. And we've seen massive declines in mental health over the last few years in all sorts of demographics. I mean, police and firefighters, nurses, their suicide rates have all skyrocketed, as well as, kids aged, I think like 10 to 19. It's like one of the leading causes of death. And now, like, there's just mental health issues among veterans. I mean, there's 22 veterans a day committing suicide. And that is absolutely insane when we think about like our authority, our government's response to that. We have veterans. Like if we just kind of just get a little hyper focused on this one particular issue, we can say that our government is not even representing veterans well. Because if we think about 22 veterans a day committing suicide, what that actually means for a week is that's more than the amount of crew that were on my submarine. So when we think about that, since 2011, this statistic has been true. So if we place that into real numbers, what that means is that since 2011, and that's 12 years, every single week, a submarine crew has been going to the bottom of the ocean and dying. If we just put that in kind of a relation of what that statistic of 22 veterans a day committing suicide since 2011 actually means, and what the real cost of the, what this, multi-decades long war has really meant. And so when we kind of put that into a larger context, we can just feel this essence of all of the weight of all of these problems. Wherever you fall on the political spectrum of, any kind of feeling, any kind of, ideology, I bet that you feel that the authority just doesn't really represent you or your life and what you want out of it. And so there's this weight that we're all carrying around. Well, over time, that's going to create a sense of, kind of a little bit of apathy. Like we just stop caring a little bit. And it's not all drastic at once, but it's a very slow chipping away, kind of death by a thousand cuts. And I think that that's what's really been happening over a long period of time, is that there's just so many problems that all of them go unchecked. We don't feel that we've reached a solution on any of them. And a lot of these problems create drastic impacts in people's lives. I mean, the realm of sexual violence creates, huge impacts of trauma worldwide, hundreds of millions of people. And, that's just one issue. And then we get into gender violence and domestic violence and all of the impact that that has. And then human trafficking and all the impact that that has. And, the impact that climate change is having on the resource scarcity and what that's doing. I mean, it just gets numerous, right? It's hard to hold all of that in. And when we get inundated with all of the news stories, we just stop caring as much, right? And it just starts to reflect and manifest itself in our little daily lives, where you see more people being, kind of prone to just rudeness in general public, right? Like you're not really caring about the common man. We've stopped caring about the community, and we've hyper focused on our individual lives. And, we stopped really recognizing the impact that we have on each other. And, I think a solution to that is just to get back to communities, get back to solving problems at a low level. We handed over all of the responsibility, whether we wanted to or not. We've given over so much responsibility of solving problems to the government over the years, right? Just the past generations. It's just a slow process of handing over all this responsibility and wanting the government to take care of so much. And yet at the same time, when we see the government not doing anything, at least not solving the problems in our communities, that becomes really challenging. And I think that the way that we take that power back is, rather than, everybody going and fighting the fight in terms of just like screaming and yelling at one another, we just come together as communities and look at how can we solve these issues that are actually affecting our community. Because I don't think there's a one size fits all answer. I think just as with sexual violence recovery and how unique and varied it is to the individual, I think communities are probably going to be very similar in that regard, in terms of there's not a one size fits all answer to solving every community's problems. And that's the problem with looking at the government, because the government wants a very quick, easy, one size fits all answer, and it will 99 times out of 100, I think, if not 100 out of 100, come up short.
But Shaun, so we were talking about moral relativism and people not caring and being apathetic. But when I hear people like criticizing the government, the biggest microcosm of the government is the military. And the military is famous for not bringing about any change until things blow up. So the case that we discussed of Vanessa Guillen, where there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on at Fort Hood, and then someone gets murdered by a perpetrator, then suddenly they want to do something about it. In your research, have you come across military sexual trauma, and how some people say, well, that's why we can't have women in the military, because it's too much of a temptation, or it's a good old boy system or something like that? What about this idea that if we criticize the government as people depending on them to come up with solutions, wouldn't be the most socialist and most like the thing that everybody complains about happens in the military? You have a system that everybody depends on, and everybody believes in, as faithfully as possible, and then it keeps failing and it keeps having problems, and all they say, well, that's just the way it is, and people kind of comply and fall in line. What can be done within that one aspect of government? And having worked at the VA, you see it goes further into the community. And you talk about veterans, so people are being trained and given jobs and they're all depending on the system, but the system is so distorted and corrupt to some points that it doesn't do what it needs to do, such as protect their members and others, both male sexual trauma and female trauma in the military. So what has been your experience, and did any of that come up while you were there, and what is the research on that subject within the military?
Yeah, I think that I mean, there was a lot to unpack there. So let me try and just talk about the first point that I want to just address here is I don't think that women being in the military is the reason for sexual assault in the military. Men are sexually assaulted in the military as well. So the idea that, oh, placing the blame again, it's kind of it's just this rape culture kind of way of, blaming the victim for a problem that, rather than looking at the solution of like stopping that behavior, we're going to blame the person that's the behavior is happening to. I don't think that's the approach at all. Yes, I think there is a massive problem when bureaucracy and systems get so large. And I think that's what we have, that we're seeing with the American military, at least. And from my perspective of what I witnessed, which is not all inclusive by any stretch of the imagination, it was a very large, very slow moving bureaucracy. And I think anytime we have that present, we're going to run into issues with creating and implementing solutions, because there are so many people in the line of making decisions. And any one of those people can kind of throw a wrench into the gears, so to speak, at getting solutions implemented and executed at the deck plate level. Just one example that I have in terms of story is, in the nuclear field, if we wanted to get a change made to even just a basic maintenance item, it required so much bureaucracy and so much time to get something passed up the chain of command, let them powwow about it, and then actually get something down to the deck plate level or change anything from a system at a system level. And it took so much time, and oftentimes no change actually occurred, and they would create little temporary fixes and solutions in order to try and mitigate risk to equipment and personnel. But I think that's just a small example of how it plays out over a large kind of gigantic system like the US military in terms of how things are played out. I think in terms of sexual violence, I just did a podcast with a woman whose name's Victoria, and she has a podcast called The Contagious Smile. And she told me her story where her husband was in the military and she was a victim of domestic violence because of him. And she actually had to have over 100 surgeries to repair the damage done that was done by him. And her unborn daughter, who at the time, her unborn daughter also sustained a lot of injuries and had to be born premature, and has had 20 some odd surgeries in order to correct the damage that was done because of that domestic violence as well. And the military knew, and the military didn't do anything about it. She actually sued the military and won. And so they still didn't prosecute him. Like it was such a wild experience to listen to, because I know she's not alone. I know that she's not alone in that this is something I've run into in my research. And it's not that I'm saying, oh, this is the military problem. This is an organizational problem, just how humans organize things, because it's the same idea that was in why the Catholic Church covered up all of their stuff, and why the Boy Scouts covered up all their stuff, and the Southern Baptist Convention covered up their stuff, and how USA Gymnastics covered up Larry Nassar for so long. It's organizations not wanting a scandal. They don't want a blemish. So they kick the can down the road. They don't punish the perpetrators. And it's a really big issue, because it doesn't, it's not like when I sit and speak about the Catholic Church, I'm not coming after the faith. I went to Catholic Church. I think that it brings people so much joy, but we can't look at the organization and what they're doing wrong and just turn a blind eye to it, I think that's a huge misstep. And when the military does that same thing, it's a misstep. So if we're talking about, how we could make things better, I think we need to keep it in that light. We're making things better. We're not trying to say that something is bad, but in some spaces it is bad. It's horrible that the military didn't press charges against one of their own that, literally beat this woman to within an inch of her life. And she had to have 100 some odd surgeries, and her unborn daughter was born and had to go into the NICU, and she had to be in the ICU for 4 days, while her daughter was being born. And the military blames her for it. Like the authorities and everybody involved say that she did it to herself. And it's crazy, man. It's crazy, the systemic problems that we have. And I know that, we get hyper focused on one person's story, but unfortunately she's not alone in that treatment across the board. And so I think in my research, if I had a solution for it, I would love to bring it to the world and fix that problem. But I think that's why we're here having these conversations. And hopefully, maybe we can galvanize a group of like minds together to sit down and have like an actual think tank and, affect policy and really try and make change. And that's really the tools that we have at our disposal. And I think a part of your back to the apathy is feeling like the tools that we have at our disposal, when we get to a point where we feel like they don't work, like, what are we supposed to do at that point? Like, do we just get apathetic and then just stop caring about the issues, stop caring about all the trauma and the violence that happens, and the corruption and the letting down that the system does? Like, it is unfortunate, and yet we still have to just keep fighting. I mean, we just have to stay strong and keep take breaks and take breathers when we need it, but we got to keep staying strong, because obviously the perpetrators and the perpetrators of violence aren't going anywhere. So those of us fighting against it can't go anywhere either.
So in the last 7 minutes, I want you to tell me about, are you getting some traction? Are you getting some awareness? And are you being invited by youth groups, women's organizations, the different people that would benefit from something like this? When my daughter was attacked twice by different boys in her elementary school, and they tried to choke her, and then she witnessed another girl getting choked, I contacted the Women's Center trying to get them to come and speak to the teachers, so the teachers would be more aware of how this type of behavior is not right. And it's easy to become apathetic and say, well, that's just, girls shouldn't play with boys, and they shouldn't have, maybe they're watching too much wrestling or something, or the parents are not paying attention or something like that. But like, I really felt like they were witnessing that type of behavior with their parents, and then they were parents were modeling it, and then the kids were doing it, and they felt like they had the right to put their hands on another child in a place where you can actually kill them. The Women's Center couldn't get their act together because of lack of funding or whatever, and the teachers got mad at me because I was putting them on the spot, and nothing ever came from it. So your book, tell us how people can get a hold of your book and of you, so you're a resource. And then, have you been able to get your message across so people are more sensitive and able to help not only prevention, but also with the people who have already experienced this type of abuse?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things that I found a challenge in putting this book together was, how do I market it? How do I get it out there? And when I went down the rabbit hole of trying to, advertise it on Facebook and Google and, Instagram and all that, it's the message, unfortunately, has to get watered down to meet the censor's requirements of being able to talk about this issue. And it's unfortunate that we live in that kind of world. So I had to look at a different approach, and I've gone to the kind of realizing that I want to get this in the hands of doctors, therapists, mental health therapists, licensed clinical social workers, people that are on the front lines in organizations doing the work. And yeah, I have gotten a little bit of traction. Dr. John Connolly, he's the founder of Rapid Resolution Therapy. I credit him for saving my wife's life multiple times over. My wife did a TED Talk. It's called The Life-Changing Power of Words. Kristen Rivas, she did a TED talk on the power of rapid resolution therapy in helping her recover from an incredibly destructive neurological kind of breakdown after traumatic grief of losing her sister to a drunk driver. And Dr. Connolly actually read my book and has been promoting it left and right because he thought that it just did such a great job at addressing this issue in a way that he himself hadn't actually thought about. He never really considered the perspective of partners nor the importance that the partners had on the healing environment. And so he's been helping out and really and pushing it strong. So that was a really big step in the right direction for me in terms of the validation from kind of a mental health community. And so he's got, thousands and thousands of therapists that he's training, kind of all over the place, all over the world. And so he's pushing it out there. And it just really lit a spark for me that I want this to be a tool, a resource for the people on the front lines that are helping people recover, talking to survivors, and sharing this resource with them and their partners so that, hopefully the therapy that, all of these therapists are administering becomes more effective in the realm of sexual violence recovery because maybe the partner's on board now, maybe the partner understands their communications a little better, they got a bridge of communication. And so that's kind of one of the big ways that I've tried to push this book out. I think you hit on another one, which was organizations, and I've connected pretty well with at least the organizations I've been able to get a hold of and reach out to. And, hopefully I can build a team of people that are helping me reach out and, get this book into different avenues. And so, it has been a really positive response so far to the community of people who are just wanting to do good. And I think that's the majority of the world, man. I think the majority of the world wants the world to be a better place. And if we can just sit down and have conversations, then we really realize how much in common we actually have when it comes to, wanting the world to be safe for the people that we love. And this is an issue that just kind of it crosses every barrier and boundary that the world kind of creates for us to be divided by. And this issue just bulldozes all of those and realizes that it just kind of treats everybody the same. And it's bad, horrible treatment. And so we need, if we all come together, I think that's the only way we get a solution. So yeah, it's been really cool in the response that I've been getting from all different walks of life, that this is a really valuable resource for people.
What about men's groups? What about men's Bible studies and things like that? Do they run for the hills when they hear you coming at them? Because I feel that men like to avoid things and to kind of suppress things. So coming face to face with your own insecurities and your own inability to help people sometimes, as well as your own almost like the temptation to be careless, because like you said, there's a spectrum, and there's people who are just careless, there's people who are abusive, and there's people who are dominating, and all of those have something to do with the abuse that women, men, and children experience.
It's very true, very true. And I think that I'm not shying away from men's groups. I think that if men's groups hear about me and want to bring me in, I'd be more than happy, of course, to come in and talk about this information, because I think it's really important. I think that men are going to be the solution to this problem. And, I think that the majority of men are, compassionate and caring individuals. I think we live in an environment and get conditioned to feel like we have to be a man in this particular way. And I think that's kind of breaking down a little bit. I know there's a pushback. I know there's always going to be, these ideas that get thrown around that this is what it is to be a man, or that's what it is to be a man. But really, I don't like playing in that space. I don't like talking and putting this information in that kind of context, because I think it's more so about what it means to be a good human being, what it means to be a good neighbor,